So it's glorious, isn't it? This week's Torah portion, at least the part that we read. It's uplifting and powerful. It gives a vision of what the society can be. It expresses deep and profound utopian beliefs about ownership of property and of people. It is really a wonderful, wonderful Torah portion that expresses sensitivity to the land and a sense of sharing and an egalitarianness that extends to almost everything, it seems. Male and female servants included, along with hired and indentured laborers. Even cattle and beasts are included. For when that Shemitah year rolls around and the land lies fallow, all of these are permitted to take from the produce of the land. And then we have that wonderful statement following the focus on the land and giving the land its proper rest in the 7th year and in the 5th year. Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. At least that's a good King James version and translation of those words. And so moving was that is inscribed even on the Liberty Bell. But it goes on in expressing sensitivity and a vision of what can be. The expression here comes in terms of the economic sensitivity that is to be extended to the Israelite who, because of dire financial circumstances, must sell himself into slavery. And there the rules again are wonderfully, wonderfully sensitive. You couldn't charge that person who fell under your authority any kind of interest. They were to live, it says, by your side. There was a finite time of service, after which point in time they would be released. And the Torah is very explicit as well. You cannot work them b'farech. You cannot work them with a rigor that is associated explicitly in the language with Egypt. They're nodding over here as I said it. Right? For that's the way the Egyptians made us work when we were slaves. God forbid we should do that to our slaves, the Torah seems to say. If not implicitly, then explicitly by its use of that particular word. It is, as I say, a glorious parsha. That is, of course, until you get to verses 44 through 46 in chapter 25. And then a very dark tidal wave seems to wash over all of that beauty that we see in the opening verses. What happens in those verses? Let me read to you. If you wish, you may follow along in your Chumashim, in your Bibles, on page 744. Just prior to verse 44, we're reading about the Israelite who falls under your authority. The shorthand for this person is the Eved Yisraeli, right? The Israelite slave. And as I said, all sorts of limits are placed upon how you treat that person. But now we read about the Eved Kanani, the Canaanite slave. And this is what we read. It says, such male and female slaves as you may have, it is from the nations around about you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also buy them from among the children of alien residents among you, or from the families that are among you who they begot in your land. They shall become your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you. Such you may treat as slaves. But as for your Israelite kinsmen, no one shall rule ruthlessly over the other. Profoundly shocking words, deeply disturbing. For within these few verses, we see that unlike the Eved Yisrael, there were no limits here. With the Eved Kanani, there were no limits in terms of the duress upon which you could work that person. And there were no limits in terms of how long you possessed them. The Bible's shorthand for forever is that these that are bought by you are held by your children. They are, or may be, an eternal possession of yours. This is profoundly upsetting and can truly darken all the wonderful sensitivity we saw at the beginning of the Parsha. It's profoundly disturbing because we just read in this Parsha, proclaim liberty throughout the land for all of its inhabitants. Oh, I'm sorry, not all of its inhabitants. We just celebrated 25 days ago, if you're counting the Omer, we just celebrated Passover, where we railed against the Egyptians for how they treated us and how they worked us. And yet here it is quite clear, and halakhic authorities will all pick up on it, and they will almost all agree, that the Eved Kanani can be worked in the same way that the Egyptians worked us. What are we to make of this? How are we to resolve this with other elements of the Torah, other elements of our tradition, other elements of our history? If we believe that the Torah only comes from heaven, then it seems that there are two tacks that are taken by a number of different commentators, both traditional and modern. If we believe that the Torah only comes from heaven, we can say, as many of them have said, that what you need to do is understand that the laws of the Torah, as it applies to the Eved Kanani, are not nearly as bad as the way they were treated by other cultures around them. That this represents a huge leap forward evolutionarily in these laws. One way of resolving it. Another way that is suggested by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the chief rabbi of Britain, he says, the Torah put these laws in, disturbing as they are, upsetting as they are, in order that we may learn on our own to wean ourselves off of slavery. This law, from his perspective, serves an explicit didactic purpose. And learning by ourselves makes that learning all the more profound, rather than just having the Torah command us. That's one resolution. Another way to resolve it is to, if you believe, like some do, that the Torah only comes from human beings, is to acknowledge simply that slavery was a common, widespread, accepted, and established institution at that time, in that part of the world. And therefore, what the Torah reflects here is merely what was going on within its time frame. Not only that, if you hold that the Torah is only a product of human beings, you could also say that what these laws show is that the Jews really did not like the Canaanites. Really. I mean, of course, weren't they human as well? Could they not be subject to the same kinds of passions and prejudice that we are today? If the Torah is but a human product, surely these are humans. We might speculate as to why it is they had such prejudice, such anger, almost such hatred, it would seem, towards the Canaanites. Perhaps it represents an insecurity. We know, going back to Genesis chapter 12, that the Canaanites were in the land even when Avram went through. Az Kanani ba'aretz, it says in chapter 12, verse 6. Maybe they tapped into our insecurity. Maybe we felt we needed to crush them. Or maybe there is history between us that we're simply not aware of, that taps into a very dark side of the soul of the people then. Such could be a way of resolving it if you hold that the Torah comes only from human beings. But my friends, what if you're like me? What if you are like me and you are neither a religious literalist or a secular contextualist. What if you are like me and you do not see the Torah as either human or divine, but both human and divine at the same time? And what if you are like me and you believe, to borrow and paraphrase Abraham Joshua Heschel's title from his great work, that God is in search of man, and that each and every moment of each and every day, God hovers around us, just as God did at the very beginning of creation, where Ruach Elohim merechefet al panei hamayim, where the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the water, over the deep, over the chaos. What if you are like me and you believe that God hovers over and around us all the time, and that just as God called from the chaos to bring forth creation, so too, each and every moment, God calls to us. God searches for us. God seeks to lure us down the path that is most sacred, that is most holy, and most divine. And that the Torah, from this perspective, represents our first, not our final, but our first attempt to articulate our response to that call. Well, then, I will tell you, from this perspective, those first two resolutions holding that the Torah is either only a product of heaven or only a product of human hands rings hollow, shall we say. The first resolution feels forced and inadequate. Really, we get to subject a people, B'farech, in the same way the Egyptians subjected us, so that we can learn to not do it? How wonderful for those people to be our little pedagogic tool. How fortunate for us. It is an utterly inadequate kind of response to also say that, well, yes, it allows us to have slaves in perpetuity, but at least we're better than the others around us. Shall we say that is a somewhat low bar? And if you hold that human beings are the ones who are responsible for the Torah, and only human beings, then fine, that contextual answer is well and good. But for us here in Shul, does it work? I don't think so. It might play well in a classroom. It might do okay in a university. It's fine, but honestly, I find it personally irrelevant and empty. It doesn't speak to how I understand Torah, how I understand God, and how I understand Israel. But from my perspective, and if you are like me and you understand the Torah as both human and divine, then we understand that in a paradoxical way, that the Torah can be both sacred and imperfect. In the same way that the people in our lives who we love and with whom we build relationships that we too would call sacred can also be thoroughly human and imperfect at the same time. And so if we look at it from this perspective, we can see the laws regarding the Eved Kanani in a different light. And we neither have to apologize for those laws nor dismiss them out of hand. But we can understand those laws. We can understand that those laws show us the power of the darkness that resides within our soul, that we can overlook our experiences as slaves and apply the same kind of ruthlessness to those around us. Such is the power that our passions can evoke within us, and such can be their control. The Eved Kanani reminds us that as far as we have come in abolishing slavery, as far as we have come as a society on a legal level, through the Emancipation Proclamation, through the 13th Amendment, and in Israel, through the Basic Law in 1992 that states explicitly that all persons are to be free, that as far as we have come, we still need to acknowledge that slavery exists. We read on Passover about slavery as if it were something in the past. We read in Passover about that slavery, and because we don't understand it as a modern phenomena, We look at it metaphorically and we ask ourselves, to what are we enslaved in our day and age? But we don't need to be so clever. We do not need to rely on metaphor to make it meaningful. For slavery is still, unfortunately and tragically, alive and well in our world today. In this book, Benjamin Skinner writes, and the book is called A Crime So Monstrous, Face to Face with Modern Slavery, that if one looks throughout the world, the level of slavery and people who are in servitude at this time is greater than it has ever been in our history. And so we can read the laws, if we have them in this week's Torah portion, about the Evet Kanani, and realize as far as we may have come, there is still so much work that we have to do. This is not an issue to be relegated to our past, but something we need to still confront in our present. And we can look at the Evet Kanani and draw a different lesson. We can draw a lesson built upon the insights of Maimonides, expanded on by a wonderful, brilliant modern biblical commentator by the name of Professor Arnold Ehrlich, who notes, and it's reflected in the translation, even though it is not accepted universally, that the word that is used when describing the Evet Kanani is, you may hold them in perpetuity, not you must. And in picking up on this, Maimonides notes that one of the laws and lessons that we can learn from this is that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. The Evet Kanani represents for us so many people in our day-to-day lives and in our world who we do not treat the way we should because we can get away with it, because we don't challenge ourselves, because we do not listen correctly and carefully enough to that call from God to be better, to be kinder, to be more loving. If one understands the Torah as sacred and imperfect, these are but a few lessons that we may derive from what on the surface is really a very troubling part of our tradition. And if we could derive and take to our hearts even one of but these three lessons, then I would say that is something too that we can proclaim throughout the land and to all its inhabitants. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.